what we're going to focus on today is going to be learning. All right, so what is learning? So learning at the most fundamental level is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. So I underlined two parts of this definition. So I underlined through experiments because it kind of reminded me, and should be reminding you guys, of empiricism, kind of learning through experience. Kind of going back to our first lesson, do any of you guys remember who kind of coined the term tabula rasa to describe this empirical theory of learning through experiments? Do you guys remember who that might have been? Okay, that's cool. It was John Locke. John Locke was the person who developed the idea of tabula rasa, the blank slate. So that's the importance of adding things to that metaphorical slate through experience. And learning is very much something we do through experience. So that's why that idea of empiricism is so important. And other part I underlined was relatively enduring, because just because you remember a phone number for about 2 minutes, that doesn't mean you've really learned it, I guess. And that's something that distinguishes just short-term memory from just something you've completely or actually fully learned. So that's something, this important nuance of that I wanted to point out. All right, so the next question is, why is it important that people and animals learn? Well, kind of looking from a more evolutionary perspective or a biological perspective, learning is important because we need to adapt to an environment. We can't just go around, let's say, find ourselves in a different environment and continue living the way we do if that's going to decrease our chance of survival or chance at reproduction, kind of a very Darwinian approach to that. But that's why learning is important for not just humans, but animals as well. So an example of that I have here is a sea slug. And basically, the sea slug exhibits a behavior called habituation, a form of learning. And habituation is basically decreasing responsiveness with repeated exposure to a stimulus. So basically, sea slugs, when they experience a strong current, they basically pull their gills, these structures out here, inside so they don't get damaged by the current. But if you take a sea slug and put them in a tidal pool or someplace where there's constantly large currents, at first they're going to be taking their gills in, putting them out, taking them in constantly because the current is constantly changing. But after a while, they become less responsive, and therefore they keep their gills out even though the current is continuing at the same intensity. So that's why habituation is important, because otherwise the sea slug wouldn't be getting enough oxygen. Another example with people is how when you walk into a room and the smell is terrible, it's like, let's say it smells like vinegar when you walk into the room. But then after about 20 or 30 minutes, you don't really notice it. If someone says, wow, didn't it smell like vinegar? It still does. It's just that your nose has become habituated to it. So your mind isn't constantly fixating on, oh my God, it smells like vinegar in here. Again, this question, always want to keep in mind what perspective we're looking at psychology from. So learning, for the most part, is going to be very much the behavioral perspective, behaviorism. And the main component of behaviorism is associative learning. So that's what it sounds like, basically learning that two events occurred together. And this is what conditioning is. We talked about classical conditioning, operant conditioning in the first lesson. Associative learning is conditioning. Once again, we have our two types of classical and operant. And classical conditioning basically involves associating two stimuli. And a stimulus, and plural stimuli, is any event or situation that evokes an automatic response or respondent behavior. So by automatic response, I mean it's something that you don't have to consciously think about. For example, when you hear a loud noise, you automatically cringe. You don't have to think about cringing. It's something that automatically happens. And basically, what happens through classical conditioning is that you begin to learn to anticipate events, basically learning that two events happen together. If A, then B, learning that connection is what behaviorism is about. And classical conditioning, the first kind of school of thought that emerged from behaviorism, basically talks about associating two stimuli, which we said were any event or situation that evokes an automatic response. Automatic being unconscious, you don't have to think about it. And how we learn to anticipate events. So let's sort of think about an example of how we learn to anticipate them. So let's say it's the first time you're a baby and you're watching a lightning strike, you're watching a thunderstorm. So once you see the lightning strike, you suddenly hear this loud noise of thunder. So the first time you're experiencing it, you wouldn't know that. But after experiencing it once or twice, you start to associate the lightning strike with the following thunder. So therefore, you're able to anticipate the following thunder just by seeing the lightning strike. So that's what classical conditioning is about. Operant conditioning is about associating a response or behavior and its consequence. So saying, if I do this, then this will happen to me. And kind of the first part of that, if I do this, they're called operant behaviors because you're operating on the environment to produce desired consequence. So let's go back to the example in the quiz. Let's say every time you make a 3-point shot, you get a cookie. So that way you would want to make more 3-point shots, so you would get cookies. You used to associate the action of making a 3-point shot with cookies that makes you want to increase your ability to make 3-pointers. And in this case, the operant behavior, or what you're doing to the environment to get that reward, would be making the 3-point shot. So that's kind of what operant conditioning is about. That was just a general overview. We'll go very in depth with this in the next coming slides. So classical conditioning, pioneer of classical conditioning and early behaviorism was this guy, Pavlov. And he basically pioneered classical conditioning through his very famous experiment of the dog, the food, and the bell. So we went over this in the first lesson. Basically, there was this stimulus, the food, the dog would drool, exactly right. And over repetition, Pavlov would basically present the food after ringing a bell. So in turn, this side would be after conditioning. Even when the dog just heard the bell, they would start to drool automatically as if food were present. So that's kind of like a general overview of what Pavlov's experiment was. And now let's go into kind of more detailed explanation of that. So this is a very dense slide. It's lots of terms that you kind of want to know about classical conditioning, because the brunt of psychology, or most of it, is basically knowing how to talk about what we see every day. So this is knowing how to talk about Pavlov's dog. So the first thing you start off in with any sort of experience of classical conditioning is the neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus is a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning. You see it, doesn't do anything to you, you don't react. The unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that naturally and automatically triggers a response. So an unconditioned stimulus would probably be like, you see sunlight, you try to block it away from your eyes because it's so bright. The unconditioned response is the naturally occurring response to the unconditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response go together. For example, if the unconditioned stimulus is seeing the sun, the unconditioned response would be trying to block it out and turning away so your eyes don't hurt. So then we proceed to the conditioned response. The conditioned response is a learned response to a previously neutral stimulus. So you learn to associate the neutral stimulus with unconditioned stimulus, producing a conditioned response. And then finally, the conditioned stimulus is an originally neutral stimulus that now, after association, basically triggers a response. So the neutral stimulus will turn into the conditioned stimulus. So that was very dense. Let's unpack it by looking back at Pavlov's dog. Let's start on this side. We see the food. So do you guys have any guesses as to what the food might be acting as in this experiment? Which one of these would the food be acting as?
Unconditioned stimulus?
Yeah, that's right. The stimulus automatically and naturally triggers a response. And what response is that? Well, we look back and the dog is drooling. It's not because the dog's thinking, I need to drool. It's because he automatically feels like kind of the natural urge to sort of salivate when food is presented. So that's what's going on there. So that's right, the unconditioned stimulus is the food. And then what would make the salivating, the drooling? What part of this terminology would be the drooling?
The unconditioned response.
That's right, the automatic, naturally occurring response to the unconditioned stimulus. Because the unconditioned stimulus, the food, and the unconditioned response, the drooling, always go together. And they go together automatically and naturally. You don't need any prior experience to start drooling at food. It's something that humans and animals do naturally. Same way as people sort of cringe away from sunlight, that's something naturally and automatically occurring. So that's exactly right, you guys. So now let's go here. So we have our unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. And then we have the bell presented. So at this point, the bell to the dog, it's just a bell. It's not doing anything for the dog really at this point in time. So what do you think the bell would represent at that point to the dog? Which one of these terms?
Neutral stimulus?
Exactly right. Yeah, the neutral stimulus. Think about neutral, not producing any response. Like it's just there. It doesn't mean anything for the dog. That's exactly right. Unless this dog has some experience in the past, Most dogs will just, when they hear a bell, saying, oh, that's just a bell, nothing to do with me. And at this point, that's what's happening with the dog. You have an unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and a neutral stimulus. But over repetition, the food is continually presented with the bell, producing, I guess, this understanding or learning process. So then this scenario starts to change a little. So now here in this scenario, after conditioning and learning has taken place, the dog starts to drool after hearing the bell. So what do you think the bell has now become in this scenario after conditioning has occurred? Which one of these terms is now the bell?
Conditioned stimulus.
That's exactly right. Yeah, because it was what? Originally neutral stimulus that now triggers response since it's been associated with the unconditioned stimulus. Because the bell has been associated so many times with the food, because Pavlov presented them together, in turn, the dog comes to associate this with the food, and this now becomes a conditioned stimulus. And the response that it evokes, the conditioned response, is drooling. But not just any drooling in response to the bell. You got to be specific when talking about behaviors like this. So kind of to recap, you start off with the unconditioned stimulus, just automatically evokes the unconditioned response, drooling. And then you have a neutral stimulus, the bell. Doesn't really matter at this point for the dog. Then over time, because you present and associate these two stimuli together, the dog begins to associate the bell with the unconditioned stimulus, the food. And then the neutral stimulus, the bell, becomes the conditioned stimulus and it starts to evoke that same reaction, even though it initially did not evoke a reaction. And this reaction is the conditioned response. So yeah, lots of terminology there. All right, so in classical conditioning, as you guys saw, it's not just a one and done deal. It's a process that requires repeated, I guess, association between the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus to actually produce, I guess, that reaction or response that you want. And that initial phase where you're continuing to associate those two is acquisition. When you acquire something, you obtain it or gain it. And acquisition in classical conditioning is basically when you gain that experience that allows you to associate these two things. So that's the first step. And then you have something that could happen if you really want to be fancy is higher order conditioning. So the conditioned stimulus is paired with a new stimulus, creating a second but weaker conditioned stimulus. So let's look at the example I have written here. We have a light is being associated with a tone, which is associated with food for Pavlov's dogs. So let's look back at the example. After conditioning, you have one conditioned stimulus, the bell, that makes the dog drool. Well, let's say we start associating the bell with something else. Let's associate it with a flashing screen. So the bell makes the dog drool, and by associating the bell with a flashing screen, eventually the flashing screen will make the dog drool. That's why it's called higher order conditioning. There's a second level of association. The bell is immediately associated with the food, but since the flashing screen is one removed, it's not as strong. So therefore the dog might not respond to the flashing screen or as intensely as with the bell. So that's kind of like second order conditioning. Think about it just adding an extra layer to this already presented sort of framework of classical conditioning. All right, so classical conditioning, it requires constant maintenance to keep that behavior, just like practice. And there's this process called extinction, where you lose sort of that association. Extinction would mean where the bell is rung, but the dog no longer responds, no longer drools. So the bell has become a neutral stimulus again. And this occurs when you constantly present the conditioned stimulus or the bell, but without associating it with the food. So let's say you keep on ringing the bell, the dog's waiting for food, but the food never comes. Then the dog would start to learn again that, hey, the bell doesn't bring food anymore and loses that association. Therefore, the dog would no longer drool at hearing the bell. So that's what happens when extinction happens. Just think about extinction, going away or dying. That association that had been created through classical conditioning is now dead. But then there's a phenomenon called spontaneous recovery, which is the reappearance after a break of an extinguished conditioned response. So for example, let's say the dog has been conditioned to associate the bell with the food and drools after hearing the bell. So for one day, the experimenter rings the bell but doesn't bring food. The dog, realizing that food no longer associates with the bell, stops drooling after hearing the bell. But after waking up the next day, the experimenter rings the bell, the dog starts drooling. This is spontaneous recovery. So after a pause, the behavior, even though it was considered extinct, reappears. And here's a diagram of that. So on the y-axis is response strength. How readily the dog drools, or how intensely they drool to the bell, is kind of what it's measuring. And this is just time. And they've divided into different phases. So acquisition is the stage where the dog would acquire the behavior. They learn to associate the bell with the food and start drooling at the bell. And that's why the behavior response strength continues to increase. So they're like, okay, yay, food and bell go together. Bell is good. But at this point, the experimenter would stop giving food whenever they ring the bell. So the dog starts to realize that the bell doesn't equal food anymore. Therefore, they stop drooling when they hear the bell. And that's why that behavior goes down. Okay, that's what happened. It's extinct. The dog doesn't drool anymore when they hear the bell. But here's the spontaneous recovery period. Let's say the experimenter waited 1 or maybe 2 days, and suddenly they ring the bell again. Some part of the dog's mind still remembers that bell equals food, and that's why they start drooling. That's the spontaneous recovery part. Spontaneous being random. It shouldn't make sense. The dog forgot it, but they do. Some part of them still remembers, and that's why the response goes up again after time has passed. Okay, so then there's complexities. Classical conditioning, like all things in psychology, is not cut and dry. There's some nuances to it, and one of those is generalization, and that is the tendency for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to trigger similar conditioned responses. So the dog, by the end of the experiment, would have started drooling after hearing a bell. But what if we, instead of ringing that bell, played a note on the piano? The dog might start drooling when they hear the piano as well. That would be generalization, because the bell sounds very similar to the piano, and that's causing the dog to drool after hearing the piano note. And a question that someone had was that, is the second extinction period shorter than the first? Yes, because let's say spontaneous recovery happens. So the dog suddenly remembers that bell used to equal food and starts drooling when they hear the bell. But if the experimenter stops presenting food with the bell, they'll lose that behavior again. It'll become extinct again. But if you guys look at the y-axis, response strength, the second extinction period starts at a place that is much lower than where the response level was during the first time the extinction happened. Therefore, extinction happens much quicker since there's less response strength to diminish from. That's why second extinction happens like that, while it might have been harder to sort of lose that association the first time around. So excellent question. So going back to generalization, basically you're conditioned to respond to a certain stimulus, and other things very similar to that stimulus both trigger that same response. For example, again, the bell being similar to the piano key. Or another example, maybe the smell of Coca-Cola triggers a response in you. Well, if you smell Pepsi, very similar, that response might be triggered as well. I guess a question that is reasonable to ask is, what might be the benefits of generalization? Well, if you think about this, it's kind of a very practical use of generalization, like a biological evolutionary use. Let's say very prehistoric ancestors learned to associate tigers with pain. Tigers are going to eat you, better run away. So whenever they see a tiger, they get scared and run away. Well, let's say it's the first time the person is seeing a lion. Well, it would be advantageous if they saw a lion thinking, that looks similar to a tiger, and gets that same fear response and runs away. That would help them survive, because it'd be hard to have to learn every single association there is in the world to sort of learn everything. But if you could generalize a little bit and say, this is similar to that, therefore they might produce similar responses, it's almost like a shortcut, almost like a way of being more efficient with what you have to learn in life or what you have to experience. So that's why generalization serves an evolutionary function. And then the opposite of that is discrimination, the ability to distinguish between the specific conditioned stimulus and any other similar stimuli. Let's go back to the dog example. So in this specific scenario, the dog has been conditioned to drool when they hear the bell. But let's say they hear a piano key or piano note and they don't drool. That's because they were able to discriminate between the bell and the piano key. Even though they sound similar, the dog was able to detect the difference and not drool when they hear the piano. So that's the opposite of generalization. And this is also another kind of thinking moment. You say, well, if generalization was good for humans and good for animals, How is discrimination also good for humans and animals? Well, you don't want to generalize too much. Like, let's say early people, they're like, fire, it's red, painful, fire is hot. So every time they see something that's red, they try to run away since they're afraid they're going to get burned. That wouldn't be very helpful, especially, let's say, they see a red flower. If everybody's running away from roses, that wouldn't be very good for survival at all. So that's kind of why discrimination is important, because you don't want to generalize to an extent where you're scared of everything or you associate something with all kinds of stimuli. So we had a question asking, so if you gave the dog the food without the bell, would it be expecting the bell? Almost. So let's go back to that diagram. So at this point, it has been conditioned. When they hear the bell, they expect the food. In the dog's mind, what follows bell is food. So when they hear the bell, they expect food. But when the bell rings and food is not presented, their expectation starts to diminish. They're like, oh, maybe the bell doesn't equal food. Food isn't coming after bell. And they start to lose that expectation and lose that association. The dog starts to realize, hey, the bell doesn't mean food is coming, and that's why the response diminishes. So applications of classical conditioning, as many important psychological phenomena, the practical applications are plenty. So the most common way that classical conditioning is used is to break unhealthy habits. For example, drug cravings, so breaking off alcoholism. So let's say someone is an alcoholic, they love drinking alcohol, and they go to a psychologist saying, hey, doctor, I have a problem. What can I do to stop drinking alcohol? So the psychologist might think, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this chemical in your alcohol. This chemical, when you drink this chemical, it's going to make you really, really sick and nauseous. And every time you want to think about drinking alcohol, put this chemical in your alcohol. So when the person drinks the alcohol, they get sick. And eventually, through classical conditioning, they begin to associate that sick feeling with alcohol. So whenever they see alcohol or think about drinking alcohol, they'll be like, oh no, I feel sick. I don't want to do that. And they'll stay away from the bottle. So that's one way classical conditioning can break off drug cravings. Food cravings, similar way. Let's say this young kid, he's a little overweight because he can't stop eating sugar. So the doctor says to his mom, hey, why don't you put this chemical that makes M&Ms taste bad in his bowl of M&Ms? So the kid eats the M&Ms, but suddenly they taste bad. And he associates that bad taste and feeling sick with the M&Ms. So because he now thinks of M&Ms as making him feel sick and making him feel bad, he wants to stay away from those. And another really interesting practical application of classical conditioning is with immune responses. So what basically happens is that something like a vaccine, if you put it in the human body, your body's immune system will kill or kind of activate whatever the vaccine is going against. So these doctors, they experimented and basically said, what if we associate a taste or a sound or a smell with this vaccine? Basically, what they began to find out was that your body's immune system began to associate taking the drug that activated the immune system with these specific tastes. So every time you sort of experience that taste, your body would activate its immune system as if it were the same as taking the drug or the vaccine. So that's an interesting sort of very kind of abstract application of classical conditioning that's in development right now. So I guess like just to sort of end it, I'll give you guys an example that I just thought of. So I'm sure you guys remember my dog who barked a lot during the last session, but my dog, whenever someone comes home, gets really excited. He starts wagging his tail, he starts barking, running all over the place. What classical conditioning would say was basically the unconditioned stimulus is someone coming home. And the unconditioned response from my dog was getting really excited because those naturally occur. And basically what happens is like we have this thing on our phones in my family where when someone comes home, it makes like an alert. It gives you a notification. And basically it makes like a beeping sound. And my dog came to associate that beeping sound with our family coming back home. So whenever he heard that sound, he gets super excited. All right, we have an example. If I remember getting nauseated from a certain food, I would start getting nauseous whenever I see the food because I got an upset stomach from it in the past. Exactly right, Grace. That's exactly what's happening. Yeah, so even seeing a food that make you sick in the past, because that association is so strong, even seeing it might make you sick or feel sick. And that's something important about classical conditioning. Some things are more easily classically conditioned than others. What Grace mentioned about taste and feeling sick from something you ate is almost immediately conditioned. It's something that's very strong. It only takes one instance of that happening to be ingrained in your memory, and it lasts for a very long time in your memory. And that's because, looking from an evolutionary perspective, that's very beneficial to survival. If something made you sick in the past, you don't want to eat it again. That's why that's conditioned very easily. It's called taste aversion. But let's say something like associating a bell with food, that's not really useful. That's not really a matter of life and death. So it'll still be classically conditioned and associated, but it won't be associated as quickly as maybe food being associated with feeling sick. So that's kind of a little interesting note about that, because some things are more easily learned than others, definitely. So I have a quick homework assignment for any of you guys that want to take it on. So, kind of the question I was asking earlier on, please find an example of a form of conditioning in your life and describe each component. So, we only covered classical conditioning today. So, if we go back, I would want you guys to sort of identify what was the neutral stimulus, what was the unconditioned stimulus, all these terms, kind of identify the framework for what happened in terms of classical conditioning, and then basically explain it, like what was your experience with it. Did you understand that something was going on or something you were starting to associate? Kind of just doesn't have to be long. But other than that, thanks so much for coming again, guys. You guys are free to go.